Hi, this is Dennis with Second Chance Tackle. I'm going to do another installment on the history of fishing companies. And this one I found quite interesting, and it took me quite some time to get around to this. It's been busy here in the shop getting folks ready for the spring fishing season, but also I wanted to do this one justice. And this one came to me by way of a viewer, Joe D. He's up in upstate New York. Very passionate about fishing tackle and fishing tackle history, and he was actually able to send me a lot of information, including a book on the Gladding, BF Gladding Company. And Gladding, many of us will recognize immediately for fishing lines, but what a story. And that's probably what took me more than anything else in terms of time. I wanted to do it justice. I hope that I do over the course of the next few minutes, and I hope that you'll appreciate this, and if there's things that you can add, by all means, please add them in it. Now, I've been focusing on fishing reels, and Gladding actually did do some fishing reels, but for the most part, they have been a line company, and interestingly enough, one of the things that Joe sent to me was Gladding turns 200 in May of 2016, and that's true. It was a 200-year celebration. From 1816 to there, and is still in business today, and it's been a very interesting journey, and we're going to talk about that. And they've actually returned to their roots. So what started as a family-run business focusing on braided lines, ropes, and cordage is today a family-run business focusing on braided lines, wires, cordage, etc., with a whole lot of things that went on in between. So let's get started. You know, today we look at braided line. Here's one that came to me, 16-pound, with very thin braided line, very strong. And we kind of think this is some kind of innovation over the last 10 or 15 years because we were so used to doing monofilament. But the truth of the matter is braided line's been around, well, in this case, for over 200 years. And the materials inside of it have changed, the characteristics have changed, it is what it's manufactured out of has changed, but really the process, the thought, and how it came to be and is today is pretty much the same as it was 200 years ago. And it's quite honestly, some of you folks see me with this little friendship bracelet. It was made by my granddaughter, and it's braided line. Right? It's just a matter of how you braid the strands, and braiding the strands makes the line all that much stronger. And in the case now where you're using polymers and the like, makes it thin and makes it perform better. But the history of braided line goes back over 200 years. And in the case of the Gladding Company, it was really known for its line. It was founded in 1816, as you saw on the brochure. It was founded in upstate New York in the Adirondacks by a fellow named John Gladding. He was the son of a New England family that arrived in colonial America in the 1600s. So he's one of these folks that can really trace their way back to early settlers. And what he did was he moved from New England to the Adirondack region, and he established a farm in Farsala, probably pronouncing that wrong, New York. And if you look at the location of this on a map, and I had to because even though I know that area, I didn't know exactly where it was. It's pretty much due west of Albany, southeast of Syracuse, and due north of Scranton, Pennsylvania. So if you were trying to figure it out, that's kind of how you figure it out. And it's a little bit west of Cooperstown, New York. So you actually have an opportunity to see a museum there. Excuse me, it's the Gladding Fishing Museum. I think now it's called the Salmon River Museum. But you'll have the opportunity to go there and to catch up on some of this really neat stuff. I'm relying on the story here. It's called the BF Gladding Company. It was sent to me by Joe. It's written and compiled by Michael Reardon and Everly Reardon, who happens to be Michael's mother. And Michael is the curator, or at least he was at the time of this book, of that Salmon River Museum, featuring a lot of antique and vintage tackle, as well as a lot of the stuff that was passed on from the Gladding Company. So let's jump into this. So John Gladding moves to upstate New York in the Adirondacks, establishes a farm, and he grows hemp, flax, and other agricultural products to keep his family going. And it wasn't long before he was using the hemp and flax to manufacture rope, chalk lines for builders, halters for horses, and fishing lines. Now, the fishing lines of the day, remember, we're not talking spinning reels here. We're not even talking the major conventional reels that we see today. It was really about fly fishing. That was the predominant type of fishing, all the way until around 1900, when Shakespeare and some others came out with the mechanical reels, and then of course the spinning reels after World War II. But in the meantime, he started by making rope, and it was all hand braided. The rope, the chalk lines, the lines used for fishing, all hand braided. So he had a staff there of about 15, 20 people, local. The town was only a town of about 350 people, so you can imagine it was a family town, and it was a family business. So he had run the business through about 1837, turned it over to his son John, who was 26 at the time, and assumed the role. And John ran the business largely unchanged through the end of the Civil War, and actually retired in 1878. At that point, he turned over the leadership to his son, Benjamin Fargo, BF, Gladding, and he was only 25. So think about that, right? Growing up in the upstate New York region, being responsible for a business, supporting 15, 20, 30, 40 employees, and only being 25 years of age and doing that. So he began working as the leader, and he also brought in his brother-in-law, a fellow named Frank Cook. And Frank became kind of the outside sales guy, while Benjamin took over the responsibilities for manufacture and on-plant site. And it was on a trip to Boston in the 1870s that Frank noticed that there was a mechanical solution where you didn't have to braid by hand any longer, but that you could use a machine to do that during the elements of the mechanical or the Industrial Revolution. And he found that there was a machine that was using mechanical braiding for sewing threads, and they figured that they could adapt that and that they could make that into a braiding machine to support fishing lines and other lines like the chalk lines and that they were doing, and they did. And Frank eventually had some run-ins with his brother-in-law, went out, split, formed another line company with a fellow named M.L. Perkins in 1892, and then got ill, and that company was merged back into Gladding. Benjamin bought the company back, and they were on their way. In the end of the century, they had over 100 braiding machines, and they were by far the dominant line producing company in the United States and maybe even the world. At that point, they were making lines from cotton, linen, and silk. And with the outbreak of World War I, the government asked Gladding to suspend the use of linen in order to support the war effort. Well, being what they were, Gladding's response was that the line was being used to catch food and subsistence by local anglers in the country, and that suspending the use of the line would actually put it would impact the food available for the war effort. And he argued that they should continue to do that so that local anglers could feed their families without impacting the war effort. Not only was he successful in doing that, but he won government contracts to supply the military with things like tow ropes, parachute cords, pilot harnesses, bomb cords. And interestingly enough, and I wish I could find one of these, maybe it's available up in the museum there. I'm planning a trip. Emergency fishing kits for soldiers who were trapped behind enemy lines. How cool would that be to find that, right? So post-World War I, Gladding's business continued to increase significantly, and they became the fishing line company. In 1933, interestingly enough, there was a group of folks that met. They became the Associated Fishing Tackle Manufacturers. They met in Washington, D.C. during the Depression, June 30th, 1933. And just a bunch of old guys, right? But boy, I would tell you, I would pay anything. Somebody said if you would go back in history to one day or so, where would you go? Well, this might make my list. Those bunch of old guys there included Charles Hedden. Hedden, as you know, was the James Hedden and Sons Company. William Shakespeare Jr., we know all about the Shakespeare Company. Ernest Pfluger, the Enterprise Manufacturing Company, who developed Pfluger reels in Ohio. Carl Kinnar, American Fork and Hoe, which became the True Temper Corporation. E.D. Abatson from Horrocks and Abatson, both out of Utica, New York, made fishing reels. Charles Kendrich from the Cortland Line Company, also in New York, doing things similar to what Gladding was doing. Ed McMahon from Bronson Reel Company out of Bronson, Michigan. Paul Johnson from Motion City Manufacturing out of Philadelphia. W.B. Perney from Montague Rod and Reel Company. Charles Herzelling from Creek Chub Bait Company. Ivar Hennings from South Bend Bait Company. And Fred Arbogast from Fred Arbogast and Company, who makes the jitterbug, right? Interesting. I don't know what the trade situations were at the time, but a lot of these guys got together and a lot of these guys acquired each other and merged and so on. So for example, just some of those things we were talking about there. Shakespeare eventually bought out Pfluger. It was the company we're talking about here, Gladding, who bought Horrocks and Ibbotson, and I believe they had purchased Bronson as well. I may be wrong with that. Ocean City Manufacturing bought the Montague Rod and Reel Company, and Gladding, as we'll find out later, bought South Bend Bait Company. And it was interestingly enough that I kind of always had that backwards. I always thought that South Bend bought Gladding, but no, Gladding bought South Bend in and around 1957. So if I get a chance, I'm a historian by nature. I'm going to go back and I'm going to try and see what happened at that meeting in 1933. But boy, to be a fly on the wall there and to understand what they were talking about at that time. And the great things that came from those companies from a fishing perspective in that time. So the Depression era, Gladding pretty much did what they do as the other ones did. And as World War II approached, Gladding became a major supplier to the military efforts, supplying cordage, wire needs, towing cables, a lot of the stuff that supported the war effort. And during the war, nylon became, well, fashionable, right? Nylon in women's hosiery, among other things. But they started to experiment with nylon as a substitute for silk because of the disruption in there. And silk, cotton, and linen were the dominant threads that they were using in braid at the time. This is an older one. I don't think you can see from there. There we go. We'll see. So the old braids of the time were cotton, linen, and silk. Silk became an issue because of the war effort, of course, with the parachutes and the like, but also just the supply chain. Cotton and linen were more well known, and from this device you can see that one of the problems, or one of the recommendations with these lines, which were organic, was to remove the line after use, because these would mold, they couldn't hold water, or they held too much water, right? They wouldn't dry. You had to get them off the reel and get them drying, and this is actually I guess a homemade device. I don't even remember where I found it. It wasn't expensive at all, but it just really piqued my curiosity. But this is a way to take line off of your reel, have that line dry, and then go put it back in when you were ready to fish again. I actually had a little hole drilled up top here where your line would go through, and then you would manually crank. Well, nylon had the advantage of shedding water. It wasn't porous, didn't absorb it, and you could actually build a line with nylon that wouldn't require the drying. Here's another one I found somewhere along the line. I wasn't quite sure what it was in the beginning, but I knew right away when I found it. You would have two forks on each side of this, and this is a drum, same idea, just kind of crank it and get that old linen or braided line off of your reels. So when nylon came along, it kind of changed the business. And then of course after the war, everything changed. You started getting the introduction of spinning reels, which weren't around prior to the war. And then you started seeing some changes in technology. So for example, in the 50s, according to the book here, Gladding came out with a product called Fiber Lube, which was a chemical process which extended the lines of the life of the lines, and also started working with composites. So they came out with a fly line called the Aerofloat, which had polymer bubbles in it that enabled the line to float and give the angler more control on casting. It was a rapid time of change in the fishing industry. And in the 50s, they also entered into the saltwater market and developed lines for the spinning reels and so on, working with the same kind of breeding technologies. So the location for this, I'm going to get this wrong, but the location is actually South Otselic in New York. And again, it's west of Albany, southeast of Syracuse, if you will, up in the Adirondacks. And they started doing a lot of expansion at this time too. They introduced a product called Playtil, and it was a full function braided nylon line, as was rapid caster nylon for spinning reels. So they stayed pretty much in their own little playground or sandbox, but they were doing what they did best, which was lineage and cords. However, they started buying competitors, and in the 50s and 60s they saw a lot of expansion. Some of them just were entrepreneurs that were single family run businesses where the founder was retiring and just looking, and some of them were strategic investments that Gladding tended to make over the course of that time. So Gladding redefines itself in the 60s, calling itself a recreation business. They buy the Dot Line Company, which was one of the attendees at that 33 conference. They bought Magic Snell, also in upstate New York, which was hooks and tackle. They bought the E.F. Payne Rod Company, which was a specialist in bamboo rods, and it was working on the introduction of fiberglass rods. Interestingly enough, one of the rods that came out of that was Harnell rods, which are considered very collectible. In 1965, they bought the South Bend Bait Company, and as I mentioned, I always thought it was the other way around, but now they're in the fishing reels. They had some fishing reels on the fly side, but here's 3 South Bend reels that were produced in that time. One of them is actually a Sunmatic, made in France, and the other one is it's a Classic 2, 360. But these are the types of things, if you make line, you might as well have a complementary product line, especially if you're going to call yourself a fishing tackle company. And they started making the reels with South Bend, and they also had a line of fly reels as well, and rods. But when they bought E.F. Payne Company, they started making fiberglass rods, and those rods and that plant became well known for producing Gladding and others. They also acquired Wilson Ranger, which was camping equipment, bowling bags, and school bags. They expanded the fiberglass works to do more than just rods. They made marine antennas, surprisingly poles for pole vaulting and other recreational uses. And a very interesting one, which plays later into the game, they acquired Pierce Simpson, a maker of electronics, including depth finders, ship-to-shore radios, and emerging citizen band or CB radios. They also acquired Kalamazoo Sled. A lot of us here in the Northeast know about American Flyer and Flexible Flyer sleds. Well, Kalamazoo Sled made those. It was Kalamazoo Sled and Toy Company out of Kalamazoo, Michigan. They acquired Vitro Agate. They made marbles, little shooting marbles for the games. And Valrecro, which was textile and fibers. And that one plays later in the Gladding story as well. So big expansion time, revenues are going crazy, and in 1968 Gladding went from a family-owned business to a publicly traded company on the Amex Stock Exchange. During the next 5 years, they continued to acquire and expand in the recreational market. They brought in a UK acquisition, KP Morit, and that was the largest manufacturer of reels in the UK. And they also bought companies that made mini motorhomes, truck campers, travel campers. They bought a company that made water skis, life preservers, and outdoor clothing, as well as dormitory and school furniture. And here's one to remember as well, called Paris Manufacturing Company, that made that stuff. Well, revenues and profits grew exponentially. They did very well in the 70s. Every year over year was greater revenue, greater profits, and it was fueled by the addition of these new companies and the rapid explosion of the citizen band or CB radio market. The revenues from Price Simpson had actually become a very significant portion of the business. And then, as all stories have a down point, a fateful decision in 1977 really caused pain to the gladding company. The FCC expanded the number of channels on a CB radio from 23 to 40. Some of us actually remember that. And banned the sale going forward of 23 channel sets. Well, that was what gladding manufactured, 23 channel, and they weren't ready for 40. They were stuck with a bunch of obsolete inventory, and the cash crunch, the resultant cash crunch from that led to them declaring bankruptcy. So they declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy, sought protection in 1977, and actually shed a lot of assets and returned to their core business over the next 5 years. I haven't been able to find out, but I believe that's when South Bend and gladding separated. But I need to do more work on that. If anybody knows, please leave it in the comments. So we're up to 1983, and in 1983, they're actually got more problems on their hands. They've got environmental protection problems from the EPA. They've got groundwater contamination from the chemicals, the dyes, the oils that they used in the manufacture of the fishing line up there in South Ostalik, and it further burdened them. So what did gladding do? Gladding worked on a reorganization plan and a sale to one of the companies that they had previously owned. It was Paris Manufacturing Company, which I told you to keep in your mind. Well, Paris Manufacturing Company purchased the assets of gladding, shed most of the stuff that they were doing, returned it somewhat to a cordage company, and that's actually what it was renamed. It was renamed as the Gladding Cordage Company, with a focus on fishing line, textiles, and workplace wear. As those suits continued to march forward, it put a burden on Paris, and Paris eventually filed for bankruptcy in 1987, about 5 years later, and at this point they completely closed the gladding plant and dismissed all employees. As part of the restructuring of that bankruptcy, one of the employees who was on the board of directors for gladding, he had been a 30-year employee, been a vice president, was on the board of directors. He put a bid in June after the bankruptcy of Paris to buy the assets of gladding, and he did that. His name was Nicholas Christakos, and he went a long way. Continental Cordage purchased the assets of the gladding plant. It was about $750,000. And then a subsequent reorganization led to it being purchased by Omega Wire in 1990, with an option to purchase gladding that they did not exercise. And in 1992, Nicholas's son, D.H. Sparky Christakos, subsequently bought the plant. They were bought by Crow Rope. This just gets fascinating to me how they just kind of played past the potato here. Crow Rope was restored the company to profitability. They started with manufacturing contracts with the auto industry and the U.S. government, but it was not kind time for Crow. Crow went through a series of mergers and leveraged buyouts, and eventually succumbed to the debt burden in 2003. They were declared bankrupt, and Sparky Christakos, who was still in the picture there, purchased all of the assets of gladding in a bankruptcy court. So essentially, this has gone completely full circle. So since 2003, gladding shed all of its manufacturing prowess except for the cordage industry. They went from a family-owned business, tightly controlled, to a publicly traded company, to a conglomerate, and then back down to a family-owned business with a focus on lines and braided line and wire products. So today, 200 years later, when they were celebrating that, the Gladding Braided Products Company is just that, a family-owned business in a small upstate town in New York, focusing on making braided line and wires and ropes, and hopefully it'll continue on for many years to come. But what a fascinating story. So when you pick up a reel like this one, when you see some line, try to find the story behind it. And again, thanks to Joe D. What a fun thing to go learn about. And I'm going to make a trip. We're down here. We're probably a couple hundred miles away, but I'm going to make a trip up to that museum there. See if we can't learn a little bit more about that area, and see what's on exhibit from the vintage collections. It includes line tackle and a lot of the company history behind BF Gladding. So I hope you've enjoyed that. It's been fun for me to research. If you have additional information about this company, I'd love to hear it. As I mentioned, I'm relying on a single source here for the most part. And if you want to hear more of these, let me know, and let me know what companies you're particularly interested in, and I'll see if I can't schedule those accordingly. So with that, this is Dennis with Second Chance Tackle. I hope you've enjoyed this. Have a great day.